Hi, and welcome to the WellnessFX training video on the female hormone panel. Now, this is a pretty basic panel. When you look at it, there's really 4 markers on there. There are the 2 pituitary hormones, FSH or follicle stimulating hormone, and LH or luteinizing hormone, as well as E2 or estradiol, the most potent of the 3 estrogens, as well as progesterone. However, if you really understand what's going on in a woman who's still menstruating in the female hormone reproductive cycle, then you can actually use those 4 markers and really know what's going on in terms of her body. And this is something that I see a lot of practitioners really just not paying a lot of attention to, unfortunately. Now, if you have not yet watched the general overview video on steroid hormone physiology and metabolism, I encourage you to do so because it will help make some of these things that are happening here make a little bit more sense. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple different things. Now, this is in a menstruating woman, and later in the video, I'll talk briefly about menopausal women and how this particular panel may relate to them. So let's talk about what's really happening in the ovaries. Now, most people would suggest that the ovaries are producing hormones like estrogen or estradiol and progesterone. And while indeed those hormones are coming out of the ovary, it's where in the ovary that they're actually being made, which is actually fairly significant. So in the reproductive years, women have millions of follicles or early eggs, if you will, that have gone through a certain level of differentiation and maturation, but then stop. And it's not until this process happens once a month that many of these follicles will continue in their maturation and development. At the very beginning of the month, and by the way, in this particular chart over here will show the different hormones as it pertains to a 28-day cycle. At the beginning of the month, if pregnancy did not occur, menstruation or the first day of bleeding would happen what's considered to be day 0 or day 1. If pregnancy doesn't occur, here's what happens in the ovary. In the ovary, every month, about 10 to 20 immature follicles go through the beginning of differentiation or maturation. Now, these were ones that women were born with, and every month about 10 to 20 start the maturation process, all on their own, really without any kind of hormone signals. Now, as you can see, they start fairly small, they start to develop, but then the jump from this particular follicle to this follicle is actually fairly significant. A lot of things happen, and that's because at this particular phase, these 10 to 20 maturing follicles receive stimulation from follicle stimulating hormone. Now, the name of that hormone makes sense because what it's doing is stimulating the follicles for maturation. So we have these follicles that begin the maturation process, 10 to 20 at the beginning of every month, and they will not fully mature. Ovulation cannot happen if they are not stimulated by this anterior pituitary hormone called FSH or follicle stimulating hormone. At the beginning of the month, if pregnancy didn't occur, all the hormones will be low, estrogen, progesterone, and the anterior pituitary, from a feedback perspective, will pick that up. In fact, the hypothalamus will do it first, but will release follicle stimulating hormone to get this process going because the body needs more hormones in order to help really prepare for pregnancy, which we'll talk about in just a second. So in the presence of follicle stimulating hormone, these 10 to 20 follicles at the beginning of the month start to mature. And when they mature, some of this tissue starts to change. And this tissue, this outer red layer, is referred to as the theca layer. The inner blue layer is referred to as the granulosa. Now, why is that significant? If you remember from the general overview of sex hormone video, the ovaries take up cholesterol. They're producing steroid hormones. And all steroid hormones come originally from cholesterol. So the ovaries take up cholesterol. And if you remember that pathway that we went over, the thecal layer contains enzymes that can take and make androstenedione and testosterone. But the ovaries don't make a lot of testosterone, ideally. What they make is a lot of estrogen. The inner granulosa layer contains other enzymes that can take that testosterone from the thecal layer and make estrogen as a consequence. So here we have follicle stimulating hormone is associated with estrogen in women, but really where that estrogen is coming from is right now these 10 to 20 maturing follicles that now have a thecal layer that can use cholesterol and turn it into testosterone, and they give that testosterone to the granulosa layer, which can take testosterone and make estradiol. So now we have estradiol that's being produced from the ovaries, but specifically it's from these 10 to 20 maturing follicles. Now let's come over here and see really what's happening. Now, if pregnancy doesn't occur at the end of the month, all the hormones should be low. Now, again, from a feedback loop, the hypothalamus and pituitary will sense these low levels of all hormones, and FSH, as you see here, will start to be secreted. So FSH will do here in green. Now, the beginning of the month, FSH should be relatively low, and we'll slowly start a trajectory upwards for the first part of the phase, which appropriately is called the follicular phase. This is the follicular phase because this is the phase in the cycle when the follicles are actually maturing and developing for what's eventually ovulation. Now you see that FSH, in the presence of low hormones, if pregnancy didn't occur, FSH will start to come up, and I'll just jump to what it does next. It actually drops off before around day 14 in a normal 28-day cycle, which is considered to be mid-cycle, obviously. So FSH starts to go up in the presence of no hormones if pregnancy didn't occur, goes up, and then actually starts to drop before mid-cycle. We'll talk about why in just a second. And for our purposes, really stays low for the majority of the rest of the month. May take a little bump up, but really, relatively speaking, is mostly low for the rest of the month. Now, because of this, we'll do estradiol or E2 in blue. Because of this, these 10 to 20 maturing follicles right now are starting to grow their granulosa layer, are taking cholesterol, and are making estrogen from it. So as FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone, is stimulating, is providing the stimulus for these follicles to really start to mature, you also start to see a progressive increase in estrogen that will go right along with the FSH curve. But interestingly, what happens is, prior to mid-cycle, FSH will actually drop off, but yet estrogen continues to go up. And we'll talk specifically why that happens in just a second. So, in the first half of the month, you have the follicular phase, which is really characterized, as you can see, by higher amounts of FSH compared to the second half of the monthly cycle, which is called the luteal phase, and higher amounts of estrogen. And all of this will make this female hormone panel very easy to actually interpret in terms of where the defect is, if things are actually normal or not, and if not, where the problem may lie. So, beginning of the month, you have follicles that begin the maturation process. Under the presence of follicle-stimulating hormone, really start to ramp up this maturation process. They make the fecal layer, the granulosa layer. They get bigger and larger. The granulosa becomes thicker, and as you can see, if you have 10 to 20 follicles that are all producing estrogen from the granulosa layer, you can see how estrogen would continue to increase. 10 to 20 follicles that are small will produce a smaller amount of estrogen. As they become larger and more mature, they'll produce more estrogen. And then what happens is this. When these follicles are maturing under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone, what happens is really interesting. Follicle-stimulating hormone will actually drop off, yet estrogen will continue to rise. And basically what's happening is when these maturing follicles require FSH for the maturation process. Without FSH, they cannot mature. What happens is when FSH drops off, and this is pretty interesting, when FSH drops off, essentially what happens is these 10 to 20 follicles that were maturing at the beginning of the month, let's just hypothetically say it was 10, 9 of them without FSH cannot continue the maturation process and will essentially just disintegrate. The one remaining follicle, and it's sort of a Darwinian survival of the fittest theory, the one remaining follicle that is the most fit, that can exist without FSH, will continue. It doesn't need FSH, which is interesting to consider. So at any rate, after FSH drops off, the thought is that really the majority of this estrogen now is coming from this very large single follicle that has a huge granulosa layer and is producing massive amounts of estrogen. At this point, this high level of estrogen is almost the now what's called a tertiary or Graafian follicle. This tertiary or Graafian follicle, when it produces massive amounts of estrogen, it's almost like it's saying to the rest of the body, I am now ready, I'm fully mature, I can be deposited into the fallopian tubes because I'm fully mature and ready to go. So what happens next is when estrogen peaks, this stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce luteinizing hormone. Now we haven't yet drawn luteinizing hormone, and that's because luteinizing hormone does not do very much at the beginning here in red, at the follicular phase, but now when estrogen peaks, the pituitary produces a very large amount of LH, and this is often referred to as the LH surge. Now again, you may see different texts and it will say that it does various things throughout, but really just looking at it in a very simplistic point of view, at the beginning of the month, if pregnancy didn't happen, FSH from the anterior pituitary begins to be produced in order to really stimulate the follicles to mature, and as they mature, they make the granulosa layer, which can produce estrogen. As these follicles mature, they produce more and more estrogen. FSH drops off. The follicles that required FSH for their maturation do not continue on. The single strongest one that could continue to mature without FSH will continue, and that's where the majority of the estrogen or estradiol comes from. Now, this high level of estradiol, at a certain point, the pituitary senses this. Again, it's almost as if this now tertiary, very mature follicle is saying, I'm ready for ovulation. You can put me into the fallopian tubes now. The high level of estrogen stimulates the anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone, and it does so in this very large surge. Now, getting back to this drawing here, this particular point, if we were to draw this, LH is in red. LH is what stimulates ovulation. LH stimulates this now tertiary or Graafian follicle to release this almost fully mature oocyte or ovum and leave behind all the rest of the stuff, the theca layer, the granulosa layer. So here is mid-cycle. Ovulation occurs because of the luteinizing hormone surge or peak. So now we have ovulation, and now luteinizing hormone is associated with progesterone in women. Where does that really come from? Now that the oocyte has been deposited in the fallopian tube, there's this excess material that's left over. Now this will slowly morph into this cellular debris that doesn't have a nucleus, by the way, and without a nucleus can't repair itself, can't maintain itself, and will eventually shrivel up and die. But this is called the corpus luteum. What the corpus luteum really is the leftover cellular matter from the tertiary follicle minus the egg or the ovum. So now the leftover cellular material turns into what's called the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum takes the cholesterol that's been trapped in the ovary and has the enzymes that can turn that into progesterone. So now we have, in brown, we'll have progesterone. Progesterone, again for simplicity's sake, because luteinizing hormone's pretty low, because there was no corpus luteum, is going to be fairly low really for the beginning of the cycle. But now let's overlay what's going on here over to here. So we had the 10 to 12 follicles that were being matured and under the influence of FSH. As they were maturing, the granulosa layer became thicker, started to make more estrogen, FSH dropped off, the majority of the follicles disintegrated. The one that could still continue to mature did so, making a very, very large granulosa layer, making lots of estrogen, stimulating the pituitary to have its LH surge, which stimulated ovulation. And now what we have is progesterone was really low throughout the majority of the cycle, but now as the cellular leftover from the tertiary follicle slowly starts to turn into the corpus luteum, what we'll see is a slow increase and then decrease of progesterone. The slow increase is as the leftover cellular material starts to turn into the corpus luteum, it will start to make more and more progesterone. As a fully formed corpus luteum, then you'll have the maximum amount of progesterone. And as this non-nucleated corpus luteum starts to disintegrate and basically disintegrate, will produce, as this process happens here, will start to produce less and less progesterone. And if pregnancy didn't occur, I should draw an estrogen. Estrogen will generally drop considerably, maybe take a little hump, but stay relatively low. All hormones will be low at the end of the month if pregnancy didn't occur. Now, why these hormones? That's the big question. Well, understand that this cycle is really in preparation for reproduction. So, at the end of the cycle, if pregnancy did not occur, all that uterine lining that had been built up is no longer needed. And this here is referring to the uterine lining. The uterine lining at the end of the month was fairly thick, and under the influence of no hormones, cannot maintain itself, and menstruation occurs. And that's why this first part of the cycle, or day 0, is really the first day of bleeding. Bleeding occurs because there's no hormones. Without those hormones, you cannot maintain the thickness of the uterus. The uterine lining is shed or sloughed off, breaking it down to a very thin uterine lining again. And here's really what happens. Notice in the follicular phase, which is an estrogen-dominant part of the phase, progesterone is really low during the follicular phase. It's an estrogen-dominant portion of the month. Estrogen is considered to be a trophic hormone, meaning it builds things or it grows things. Estrogen on the uterine lining has the impact of thickening the uterine lining or thickening the uterine wall. And again, this makes sense because the whole purpose of the cycle is for reproduction. And if reproduction is going to take place, you need a uterine lining, a uterine wall that's prepared and ready for the possible fetus. So under the influence of estrogen, the uterine lining, which is now very thin because menstruation occurred, in the presence of estrogen will start to thicken the uterine lining. Now, pregnancy can't occur really before the egg is deposited into the fallopian tubes. So because of that, it's really just a thick uterine lining right now. Notice that the second half of the cycle, which is called the luteal phase, because of the corpus luteum, is now producing progesterone. And under the influence of progesterone and small amounts of estrogen, the uterine wall will still continue to grow and become thicker. But now progesterone starts to vascularize this, meaning it puts a lot of blood vessels in it. So it has blood and oxygen and nutrients, and it is optimal for if pregnation were to take place and there was a fetus. So under the influence of progesterone, the uterine lining not only becomes thicker, but becomes highly vascularized. And that really is what a woman sees when she bleeds at the beginning of the cycle or has menstruation. That if somebody was only losing tissue, it would just be tissue and there wouldn't necessarily be a whole lot of blood. The reason why bleeding takes place is because this is a highly vascularized tissue at this point. So at the beginning of the month, when bleeding takes place, you're not only losing the uterine tissue, but also all of the blood and the vascularization that was taking place because of progesterone. So now, just to quickly review, if at the end of the month pregnancy does not occur, the hormones drop off. And notice that it's the hormones, estrogen and progesterone, that are maintaining the uterine lining. If hormones drop, then this lining can no longer sustain itself and is sloughed off or shed, and that's menstruation. At the end of the month, if there are no hormones, the anterior pituitary picks up that signal, starts to make FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, which tells the 10 to 20 maturing follicles at the beginning of every cycle to start maturing, to make this thecal and granulosal layer, to start making hormones, specifically estrogen, to help thicken the uterine lining. At some point, there's only one follicle left, which is where the majority of the estrogen comes from. When it peaks, it's, again, almost saying, I'm ready, I can be deposited into the fallopian tubes now. And what happens is, under the influence of the luteinizing hormone surge, because of the peak of estrogen, ovulation takes place. The cellular remnants of the tertiary follicle slowly start to turn into the corpus luteum, and then finally disintegrate into what's called the corpus albicans. And right here is where you get that hump of progesterone, that as it turns into the corpus luteum, it makes more and more progesterone, starts to make less because it doesn't have a nucleus, it can't repair itself, and that is to help vascularize the lining. So now the question is, how do we use the female hormone panel from WellnessFX to really see what's going on here? It's really helpful to know what hormones are elevated during what particular portion of the phase. And I will say this, if the woman does not know when in her menstrual cycle that the blood chemistry panel was drawn, or the female hormone panel was drawn, then that information is not useless, but you really cannot take a lot of information from it. So the first thing that I would do, if looking at that panel and talking or consulting with a woman on the phone, is ask her where in her cycle she was when she did this particular panel, because then and only then can you really accurately determine what's going on with her cycle. So in terms of FSH, let's just pretend that the woman did the female hormone cycle, or the female hormone panel, and let's just say it was around day 10 or day 11. Now, what should you see on a panel that was done around day 10 or day 11? Obviously, LH and progesterone should be within the laboratory reference range, which will be relatively low for the follicular portion of the cycle. One would suspect to see a high level of FSH, or the reference range being higher, a high level of FSH and a high level of estrogen. So what you would really see is higher FSH and estrogen or estradiol to LH or progesterone, and that would consider to be normal. Let's talk about some abnormalities that could happen at this particular phase, though. So let's say on the panel, and the woman did her blood chemistry around day 10 or 11 of her cycle, and it was a 28-day cycle. If FSH was low and estrogen is low, physiologically that makes sense, because understand that, again, and this is where this comes in handy, if FSH is low, what's not really going to occur? The maturation of these follicles, which are the ones that are going to be producing estrogen. So if for some reason FSH is low, and therefore estrogen is also low, physiologically that makes sense. But then the question is where's the defect? The defect would lie probably in the hypothalamus or the anterior pituitary, because estrogen may have been normal if FSH was normal, but the fact that FSH is low, there's no stimulation for these follicles to mature, to make the granulosa layer, or to make estrogen. So if FSH is low and estradiol is low in the first part of the cycle in the follicular phase, what you're probably looking at is some kind of anterior pituitary defect that's causing insufficient amounts of FSH to really produce this cycle. On the other hand, let's say again on day 11 or 12 or so of the follicular phase, let's say FSH was normal but estrogen was low. Where's the defect? Well, if FSH is normal and estrogen is low, the defect is probably somewhere in the maturing follicles. Now, this may be something that the woman actually needs to go out and be referred to a gynecologist, for example. Excuse me. Because you may be looking at something within the ovaries where it's not working well. On the other hand, proper nutrition, diet, lifestyle, and exercise is, according to studies, been fantastic in really evaluating and helping this process. So it may be that if the woman is relatively unhealthy and maybe following a high processed food diet, low omega-3 fatty acid intake, some subclinical chronic inflammatory processes going on, then yes, maybe this process doesn't take place appropriately. But at any rate, if in the follicular phase, sort of like mid-follicular phase, if FSH is normal or even elevated and estrogen or estradiol is low, then the defect is going to be within the ovaries, and more specifically within the maturation of these particular follicles. And really, nutrition may help out, but you may want to refer her to her gynecologist or OBGYN. All right, so now let's take a look at if somebody were to do the female hormone panel, but it was somewhere in the luteal phase. And we'll just say somewhere between day 14 and day 28 of an average cycle, and we'll just say somewhere in the middle, like around day 20, 21, or 22. If the woman says, I was around day 22 of my cycle, what would you expect to see? Well, FSH would probably be relatively low, as would estrogen, and ideally what you'd like to see is relatively high progesterone. LH, because it occurs more of a surge type of fashion, the only time that you would pick that up is if it was done mid-cycle. But at any rate, if it was done mid-luteal phase around day 21, what you would ideally see is a relatively higher amounts of progesterone and lower amounts of estradiol, and the pituitary hormones will probably be relatively low as well. So what can be some issues or defects here? Let's say, for example, that a woman had low progesterone and possibly higher estrogen, or it could just be low progesterone and anything else with all the hormones. Where does progesterone come from? Well, progesterone comes from the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum exists because of the LH surge. If the LH surge does not occur, then the tertiary follicle may not release the ovum and never turns in, therefore, to the corpus luteum, never making progesterone. Second to that, if this tertiary follicle remains in the ovary, what you would see is the granulosa layer may potentially be making estrogen or estradiol, keeping estradiol high in the second half of the cycle, or the luteal phase. So if you were to see low levels of progesterone, the thought is because there's really a lack of adequate corpus luteum to make that progesterone. Then the question is, why is there no corpus luteum? It may be because there was a blunted luteinizing hormone surge, not stimulating ovulation, and really just retaining this tertiary follicle within the ovary, creating high estrogen and therefore low progesterone. Some of the same things, and this is the theme throughout a lot of these hormones, there's been a number of different things that have been shown to suppress pituitary hormones, not just FSH and LH, but growth hormone, ACTH for the adrenals to produce cortisol, for example. And there's a number of different things in our society today that have been shown to inhibit some of these pituitary hormones. Most of them really lead back to a poor diet, poor lifestyle, and things like dysbiosis, producing lipopolysaccharides, inflammation, and some of the cytokines, high cortisol, stress, certain heavy metals have all been shown to inhibit the pituitary in making the pituitary hormones, and therefore really short-circuiting many different parts of this particular cycle. The last thing that I want to comment on is if, for example, you have the blood chemistry that was drawn somewhere mid-luteal phase and progesterone was low but estrogen was high, something else to consider is improper liver detoxification. These steroid hormones are metabolized and detoxified and cleared out of the body via the liver. So if there's any kind of liver dysfunction, even subclinical, that what can happen is these hormones are not cleared out. And remember, throughout this entire video, what I said was if pregnancy doesn't occur, the hormones will drop. Now, if the liver's not functioning well, if pregnancy didn't occur, the hormones may not drop. And understand that this is a domino sort of process. It's the low levels of hormones at the end of the cycle that stimulates FSH to be produced in the first place. Without proper FSH, there's not proper estradiol. Without a proper estradiol peak, there's not a proper LH surge. Without a proper LH surge, there's not a proper progesterone curve. And you can see that essentially an entire dysfunctional menstrual cycle can be because of poor liver detoxification or elimination of the sex hormones. Now, looking at the rest of the blood chemistry, is there any ways that you might be able to get some insight into this? And absolutely. One thing that I've personally seen clinically in my practice very often is if albumin, the plasma protein made in the liver, is low, right around 4.0, 4.1, very commonly those women also have menstrual irregularities in terms of their hormones. And by supporting liver detoxification pathways, both phase 1 and mostly phase 2, that very often this cycle can correct itself to some degree. So consider that maybe a abnormal female hormone panel is actually because of the inability to clear out, detoxify, metabolize the sex hormones. And if that doesn't occur, the entire cycle can therefore be abnormal. Now, that was all about menstruating women who are still cycling. Quick comment about if a woman who's menopausal does the female hormone panel. And here's basically what you would see. In a female, in a postmenopausal or menopausal woman, the ovaries stop going through this particular process. And therefore, what happens is the circulating levels of hormones, estrogen and progesterone, that was required to build and maintain a highly vascular uterine wall is no longer needed. Estrogen and progesterone are still needed by a menopausal woman, although in much lower amounts. Because of those lower amounts, the LH and FSH on a panel of a menopausal woman will actually be quite high. And that's because the pituitary is sensing a relatively low amount of estradiol and progesterone, saying, where are my hormones, making more FSH and more LH in the attempt to get the ovaries to produce those, but the ovaries are no longer going through this process, and the estrogen and progesterone are not from an ovarian source. In fact, in a menopausal woman, the ovaries produce very little to, if any, hormones at all, and the vast majority of the woman's sex hormones, like testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, actually come from the adrenal glands. So proper adrenal gland function is required for a menopausal woman to make estradiol as well as progesterone. If in a menopausal woman you see high FSH and LH, that's considered to be completely normal. And if there's any alterations in either estrogen or progesterone, it's probably from an adrenally based source. And looking at other panels like cortisol, for example, to look at, or maybe even aldosterone as a hormone, can be helpful in looking to see if possibly there's some adrenal issues, and that's why they're not producing adequate amounts of these sex hormones after menopause. So I hope you found this particular video on the female hormone panel helpful, and I will see you in the next video.